First of all, thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm very sorry I can't be there in person. I remember very fondly my visit with you folks at RC4 back in 2018, and being hosted by Lux, and it was a really wonderful visit. My wife was with me, and we really enjoyed getting to know folks at RC4 and getting to know Singapore a little bit. So to get ready for tonight, I did have some Singapore food for dinner, and it's getting me in the mood. So I need to share my screen. Let's see if I can do that now. And here we go. All right. Are you all able to see my screen?
Yes, Prof.
Okay, great. So here's what I want to talk about tonight. I want to talk about why we need system dynamics and why we need RC4. And then I'm going to give some examples of some of the ways that system dynamics has been applied for important, impactful global problems. So let's get right into it. And I would invite you to ask questions and interrupt at any point. We shouldn't wait till the end for questions and answers. So you can just raise your hand in the chat. I think that will work. And let me know, or Locke, as the moderator, you can just interrupt me. I think that would be great. So it's a wonderful thing that you all have been doing for the last 10 years. The world really needs system dynamics and systems thinking. And the question is why? So let me give you some examples. Here you've got the Lahaina fire in Maui just a little over a year ago. 97 people died and the entire town was essentially wiped out. So why is this a relevant example? It's because of the phenomenon that we call in system dynamics policy resistance. So policy resistance is not the idea that as a policymaker, whether you're a politician, a leader in a corporation, an NGO, in civil society, community, that you know what needs to be done to address a pressing problem, but you can't get it implemented. That's not the idea, although that does happen all the time. Now, policy resistance is the situation where you're faced with a difficult problem or challenge. You get all the best advice you can. You actually implement the action, the policy that you believe is best able to solve the problem, and it doesn't work. Or far more insidiously, it works in the short run over here, but then the problem comes back later somewhere else, and often worse than before. So why is this fire, this terrible fire in Maui, so relevant? Well, forest fire suppression, which has been the official policy of many countries where there's wildfire risk, it works in the short run. In the United States, the Forest Service was founded in 1905 with the mission of preventing and suppressing fire. And for the first 50 years or so, it worked. The data show fires were on average falling, damage falling, lives lost falling. But since about mid-20th century, it's been going back up, and it's accelerating greatly right now. So why is that? What is there about the success of the policy that leads to its later defeat? Well, part of the story, of course, is climate change. We'll talk about that more in a bit. But a great deal of the problem is that if you succeed in preventing and suppressing forest fires, you're going to build up fuel in your forests. More trees per hectare, more dead branches, more leaves on the ground. And then when fires do get started, they have so much more fuel, they burn hotter, less predictably, they spread faster, they can jump over your fire breaks, and damage increases, lives lost increase, and you see disasters like the Lahaina fire. So it's the very success, the initial success of the policy that leads to its own later failure. So let me just give you a couple more quick examples. What happens when there's terrible traffic in a city? Well, we build more roads, put in more roads, put in more lanes. The very first thing that happens is it's easier to get around. But as a direct result of that, people drive more. They get more cars, they stop riding transit, and they move farther away from the city center because then they can have a bigger house for less money. That locks them into driving because often the transit system doesn't get out to where they now live. So then even when the congestion builds up later, they're stuck. They still have to drive. And the consequence is we often see traffic congestion getting worse after building roads. In the business realm, the data are pretty clear that mergers and acquisitions often, usually, destroy value for the acquiring company. The acquirer always says, oh, we're going to eliminate cost by eliminating duplicative back office operations. We're going to have scale economies and economies of scope and complementary product lines, and we're going to therefore grow faster and earn more money. And often it's just the opposite. They destroy value. And a good example of this is the phenomenon of SPAC, special purpose acquisition corporations. How about on operations? Process improvement programs. Most business people have experienced a wide range of these programs, whether it's re-engineering or Six Sigma or any other what we call TLA, a three-letter acronym. And even though we know these techniques work, most companies that have tried them found that they often fail. Can't get participation, there's no results, people become cynical about the next one, and improvement falls behind. Same thing with projects. Those projects could be large construction projects, infrastructure, building airports, whatever it is, or they could be very small projects in an organization. Projects are chronically late, over their budget, and wrong, meaning they fail to deliver what the customer really wanted at the quality they needed. And this has been a chronic problem since the pyramids, still unsolved. A little more seriously, what about antibiotic and pesticide, herbicide resistance? These are miracle substances, but we now have major problems with antibiotic resistant pathogens. There's essentially no family of bacteria that don't have resistance to at least most, if not all, of the antibiotics that are used to treat them. And it's the same with pesticides and herbicides. So how is this policy resistance? Well, when we use these substances, they work very well in the short run, but as a consequence, we've created horrific, unnatural selection pressure that favors the emergence and evolution of the resistant pathogens, insect pests, and so forth. So it's the initial success that causes the later failure. And then let me give you one more that's maybe somewhat controversial: economic growth and well-being. What's the purpose of economic growth? It's to improve human welfare, to improve well-being. And for most people in the world, the last few hundred years of rapid economic growth have in fact delivered critical improvements to our welfare. Basic needs are met. We have public health, we have good education and so forth, if we live in the affluent world. There's still more than 1 billion people in the world who haven't enjoyed that growth. But for people like everyone in Singapore, everyone in the United States, everyone in all the other affluent developed countries, the connection between economic growth and well-being has been broken. In fact, the evidence is very clear. Economic growth is now harming well-being. So there's a lot of good scientific evidence for this proposition, but let me show you my favorite example from the famous rapper Notorious B.I.G., who famously rapped that mo money, mo problems. The more money we come across, the more problems we see. Well, okay, so that's not really evidence, but let me show you some evidence. Here is real income per person, real GDP per person in the United States from 1970 to the most recent data. And over this period, it's grown by 2.75 times. It's almost 3 times larger. People are almost 3 times wealthier, more affluent than they were as recently as 1970. What's happened to happiness in the United States? It's been steadily falling, and the decline is statistically significant. You can see the big drop through the COVID pandemic, and then it's rebounded. That downward slope is statistically significant, even if I take out the impact of COVID. Well, that's the United States. And some of you may think, yeah, that's a country in decline. There's income inequality. There's all kinds of problems. It's politically polarized. All of that's true. What about Singapore? Well, over the period from 2011 to 2022, real income per capita in Singapore grew by 34%, but Singaporeans are much less happier now than they were in 2011. So the graph on the right shows average happiness, average enjoyment of life, average feeling of achievement of your goals, and they've all fallen dramatically even through 2022 after the pandemic has eased. But even without that, it fell dramatically. Now, I don't have time to go into why this is happening. You can ask in the questions, but these are all illustrations of policy resistance. The phenomenon where we have limited mental models that lead us to adopt policies that attack the symptoms of problems instead of their underlying causes. And then we are surprised when the feedback processes in the environment lead to the later failure. And of course, this is not a new phenomenon. Here you see a Grecian urn, and it's from several thousand years ago. And what it shows is Hercules battling the Hydra. Now, the Hydra was a monster that doesn't exist in real life. And the characteristic feature of the Hydra, as many of you will know, is that if you cut off one head, two more would grow back. This, of course, doesn't exist. It's a metaphor for policy resistance that the Greeks invented to explain why they were so often experiencing this policy resistance. And it's not just in the Western cultures. In the Tao Te Ching, Lao Tzu writes that the sharper the weapons, the more trouble in the land. The more ingenious and clever people are, the more strange things happen. That's policy resistance. So why is this going on? Well, the problem is our limited mental models. So a lot of people think, well, I know my goals. I know what I want to do. I want to gain market share, or I want to be wealthier, or whatever it is. That motivates my decisions. My decisions alter the state of the system. Problem solved. Well, that's just fundamentally not correct. So I'll give you an example. I'm a bicycle commuter. I have about a 17-kilometer ride each way when I go into work at MIT. And so when I'm riding down the bike path, I have to make sure that I stay on the right-hand side of the path. We drive on the right. So that's my goal, stay on the right. But that information is not enough for me to know what to do, what decisions to make. The decision I have to make every few tenths of a second is, which way do I turn the handlebars right now? Well, let's take a look. Let's see if that'll go. So here I am, I'm riding down the bike path. If I'm too far to the left, I could crash into somebody going the other way. If I'm too far to the right, I'm going to hit a tree. So it's not enough for me to know the goal. I have to also have feedback that shows me where I am relative to the state of the system. This is the fundamental idea of feedback. I have to know not only what I want, but what's happening. And it's the gap between those that drives decisions. Now, here's the problem. If managing a complex system like a company or a country was as simple as riding a bicycle, you wouldn't need to be studying system dynamics at RC4. But of course, it's far more complicated than that. This represents our typical mental model. We have our goals, we know what's going on, we make decisions, we constantly strive to bring the system closer to our goals. But we're embedded in this much more complex system in which our decisions have multiple effects. What you hear all the time is, oh gosh, our policy failed because there were unanticipated side effects. There's no such thing as a side effect. There's just effects. Your decisions have multiple effects. The ones you thought about in advance, and especially the ones that worked out well for you, yep, that was my plan all along. I'm a fabulous manager. You should promote me and give me a big bonus. And everything else, especially the things that feed back to bite you in the rear end, that wasn't my fault. That came from out there. That was a side effect. There's no such thing as side effects. Instead, there's just all the effects of your actions. And many times those unintended consequences, unintended and unaware consequences that you're unaware of, they feed back and move the state of the system away from your goals. Of course, it's way more complicated than that because there's all the other actors, all the other agents in the system. That could be in a business, your customers, the financial markets, your competitors, your suppliers, the citizens of the communities in which you operate, the natural world that's supplying materials and resources you need and taking your wastes away. They all have their own goals, which are typically different from your goals. And since we all live in the same world, whenever you move the system closer to your goals, you're necessarily pulling it away from their goals, and they won't just sit there and take it. They're going to respond. Of course, they also have limited mental models and generate unintended consequences of which they're often unaware. Now this is getting fairly complicated. In addition, the goals themselves are part of the system, and there could be important time delays in many or all of these links. Now you've got a system that's very difficult to manage and one that's going to outstrip your mental simulation capabilities, which is why we so often develop formal simulation models in system dynamics. So what is our task? What is our goal as we strive to become better, more capable systems thinkers? The world is like this. We make decisions. Those decisions change the world, which then give us new information that changes our next decisions. Put this picture on your mirror in your bathroom. So every morning when you're brushing your teeth, you'll remind yourself that everything is continuously evolving in a complex feedback system. But of course, systems thinking has to go well beyond slogans. A lot of people in the systems thinking area, they will tell you that, yeah, everything is connected to everything else. And you can't do just one thing. And we have to look holistically at all the problems we face. All true, not helpful. You have to move beyond the bumper sticker slogans to operationally useful, rigorous, grounded theories that are tested with evidence. This requires focusing on the feedback structure of our systems and avoiding blame. It means we have to work across disciplines. It means we have to have a rigorous evidence base, qualitative and quantitative, not just quantitative data, and the rigorous methods to generate reliable evidence. And as I think you all know, system dynamics and systems thinking, there's a major technical component to that, mathematical modeling and causal loop diagramming and so forth. But it's also something where you have to develop your soft skills, your skills of active listening, of empathy, of being able to walk in the other person's shoes so that you can really understand the perspectives, the feelings, and the beliefs of the folks that you need to be working with and learning from. And I'll add one more. You need to avoid what we call gazinta diagrams. So what's a gazinta diagram? Well, it's a diagram that shows a huge complex system and all the pieces of the system are interconnected. In other words, this goes into that and this goes into that and everything's connected. So let me give you an example. This is a very famous Jackson Pollock painting, number 5, painted in 1948. This is priceless. It's hanging in a museum. It is priceless. Here's a causal loop diagram in which everything's gazinta to everything else. That's worthless. Priceless, worthless. Priceless, worthless. Learn the difference. Okay, now let's talk about some examples. There are so many examples of system dynamics that have been applied to important, worthy problems all around the world in every domain. You see a small list here: eradication of polio, healthcare reform, process improvement, strategy for businesses, strategy for NGOs, energy and climate policies, child welfare, medical and healthcare, and group model building. which you're going to hear about next from my friend and colleague, Professor Peter Hubman, and many, many more. But I'm going to use the rest of my time to talk about two examples, COVID and climate change.
Professor Sterman, sorry to interrupt you. It looks like some online audience are not able to see your slides. So can you kindly reshare it if you, and maybe that works. Sorry to bother you.
Okay. Let's try that. I'm going to reshare. I've got a message that says my shared screen can be seen only by host and co-hosts. I think you need to do something at your end.
Sure, Prof. Thank you.
Let me know if you're able to solve that problem.
Yes, it
or
looks
if there's
like
something I need to do. But...
Thank you, Prof. It is working now.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to, well, let me, since you didn't see it, here's that Jackson Pollock. This really is priceless. And then here's a causal loop diagram that really is worthless. Priceless, worthless. Okay. So I'm going to focus on COVID and climate change. And the graph on the right shows Singapore with projected sea level rise over the longer term. And well, it's obviously catastrophic if we allow that to happen. But let's start with COVID. So this set of graphs shows COVID's evolution in Italy. And I'll show you why I picked Italy in a minute. I think it's important not always to focus on the United States or the other big countries. Italy is quite interesting but also quite typical during the COVID pandemic. So the top graph is confirmed cases per week, different scale deaths per week, and then vaccine administration once the vaccines became available here. And you can see just how severe the toll of COVID has been around the world. I'm only showing you through middle of March 2023, because that was exactly 4 years after the World Health Organization declared COVID to be a global pandemic. All these numbers are larger today, but this is horrifying enough. 7.5 million people now are thought to have died. And we know that cases and deaths are underestimated, underreported. But take a look at the dynamics. COVID has come and still comes in waves. Some of that is due to the emergence of new variants, but very few of those waves are actually associated with the emergence of new variants of the virus. So what's going on? Let's zoom in on the first wave of COVID in Italy. So the top graph is incidence, new reported cases in cases for people per day from mid-February 2020 through June of 2020. There's rapid growth followed by a peak and a substantial decline, almost disappearing by the middle of June in 2020. And the bottom graph is cumulative reported cases, so just the accumulation of the top graph. So how can we model that? Well, the classic way to model that is with the famous SEIR epidemic model, one of the most famous and widely used models in all of epidemiological modeling, and including in system dynamics. It's SEIR for susceptible, exposed, infectious, removed. You have a susceptible population, and essentially everybody in the world was susceptible to COVID when it emerged because it was a novel pathogen. There's some rate at which they become exposed and infected, but there's an incubation period. So you have a population that's been infected or exposed, but they're not symptomatic and they're only mildly contagious. And then symptoms emerge and people become quite contagious. And then they either get better or they die. And this is called removal in epidemiology, and they enter the removed population. Very famous model, widely used, has two reinforcing feedback loops, the contagion feedback, which is how the epidemic grows exponentially at the beginning, and eventually the epidemic wanes because you run out of susceptibles. So the infection rate has to fall. This model, though, is essentially purely biological. There's no behavioral response to the risk. There's no possibility of vaccination or new variants. People are immune forever in this model, and there are many, many other limiting assumptions. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to stop the PowerPoint, and here's a simple system dynamics model. What I've got here, this is the SEIR model, exactly as I just showed you. And the graphs here are the data. The red line is the data for that first wave in Italy. Bottom graph here on the right, incidence, new cases per day. Top graph, the accumulation of that, cumulative cases. Same data over here, just a different scale. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to run this model, and let's see what happens. Okay, so I've chosen parameters that replicate the growth phase very, very well. So during the initial growth phase, the first month or two, we see that the model in blue does a fantastic job of capturing the growth of the epidemic in Italy. But it doesn't stop. It keeps going until almost everybody, at the time of the pandemic, the population of Italy was 60.3 million people. And given the speed with which the epidemic unfolds, the high, what we call basic reproduction rate of the virus, almost everybody in Italy would have become infected, and many, many people would have died. Given the infection mortality rate, millions of people would have died. It would have been an unbelievable catastrophe. Now, that didn't happen. Well, maybe the parameters are wrong. Maybe if I change the infectivity or how fast the virus can spread, I can fit the data better. The answer is no. There's no way to do that. The biological model alone can't do it. What's missing? What's missing is a set of behavioral feedbacks. Well, I've built that in. Let's take a look. So I've added one more feedback loop. This is super simple. I've added just one more feedback loop that says when people perceive risk of getting infected and being harmed, they're going to reduce their contacts. They're going to wear masks. They're going to socially distance. The government may impose a lockdown, cancel schools, and so forth. And that will reduce transmission, which will eventually then reduce incidents and cases and deaths. Now, there's a time delay in this feedback loop because people don't instantly and correctly perceive risk. So there's a time delay there. Let's now look at some of the parameters in a little more detail here. You don't need to understand all of these, but there's a time to perceive the risk. There's a time to forget the risk. And then there's an effectiveness of the social distancing and safer practices. So let's turn the behavioral feedback on. So I'm gradually strengthening the behavioral feedback where people become concerned about being infected, and they then engage in social distancing, wearing masks, and so forth. Now, I'm not trying to optimize the fit against the data. I'm just doing this heuristically, but very clearly the fit to the data is now excellent. And it's clear that without that behavioral response, the epidemic would have been far, far worse. It would have been a catastrophe. And with it, we can explain what actually happened. Now, one more thing about this, and that is there's no waves. Here I'm simulating the model for a couple of years. There's no waves. Why is that? That's because I've assumed once people perceive the risk, they never forget that. They don't go back to normal. That's obviously not correct. As soon as the risk is perceived to go down, as it is here because there's almost no new cases, everybody needs to go back to their normal lives. So people go back to work and they go back to normal social encounters, and kids go back to school, and sporting events are back on the table, and so forth. So let's model that by having people gradually, quote, forget the risk and go back to their normal lives. And as we do that, what you see is you're setting the stage for the next wave. Because as people go back to normal, there's still an enormous number of susceptible individuals, and you get then more transmission, and that flows through the chain until a second wave comes, which again persuades people, holy cow, there's a lot of risk here. I need to go back to social distancing. Now, this is a very simple example. This is a teaching model, and we use it in our classes at MIT all the time. We have our students, introductory system dynamics students, build this model. But let's actually now take a look at a more serious version of this that we used in research and that had some policy impact. So let me go back to the slide. So what Hajir Rahmandat on our faculty did, together with Lim Se-yang. Lim Se-yang is a former doctoral student of ours. He grew up in Singapore. He's old enough that he wasn't able to go to RC4. That he didn't exist at that time. He was at Raffles, but then he came to the United States for his undergraduate education and then did his PhD in system dynamics with us. And now he's a postdoctoral associate at the Harvard Medical School and Harvard School of Public Health, the Chan School of Public Health. So TY, as we call him, Lim Se-yang and Hajir Rahmandat and I, we built a much more realistic policy relevant version of the model you just saw. It's essentially just a more detailed version of the model you just saw. And there's a paper published in System Dynamics Review on this that I believe is open access and you can all take a look at later. And what's important about this model is not only more disaggregate detail, but all these rates of flow, all of the behavioral dynamics are endogenous. And we include testing and treatment capacity, learning by doctors and healthcare providers that improve survival rates over time. And then the question is, how did we estimate all the parameters? Well, so first of all, we run this model simultaneously for 93 nations, every nation in the world that published enough data for us to estimate the model parameters. And that included Singapore, but it didn't include China or Brazil. But how do you estimate all the parameters in a model like this? Well, we used a state-of-the-art Bayesian, hierarchical Bayesian estimation procedure and tested it very, very carefully. One of the core ideas of modern system dynamics is you can't just look at your model output and say, yeah, here's a graph that compares the model output to some of the historical data and looks good to me. That's called the LGTM test. It looks good to me. Not acceptable today if you want your model to be rigorous, grounded in good evidence, and uncover the latent errors that might exist. So how well does that model do? These are just a few of the 93 countries. You can see the data, the reported data for cases in blue and deaths on a different scale in red for a variety of countries here. And you can see the multiple waves, all with different timing because it's not a calendar or a new variant effect. It's that behavioral feedback. And there's quite a lot of variation and inaccuracy in some of the data. So how did we use this model? We used it with the estimated parameters to estimate the true number of cases and the true number of deaths. And you should read the paper to see what the results were. But basically, cases were dramatically underestimated by nearly an order of magnitude on average, more in some countries than others. And deaths were underestimated by 30 to 50% as well. So quite a lot of publications have come out of this, policy relevant, published in some of the best journals, and you should all take a look at this. Now, of course, we don't expect students to be able to build a model of this kind of complexity right out of the gate, but it's important for you all to know that this is now possible, drawing not only on the best practices in system dynamics, but taking advantages of all the new developments in computation, in other modeling techniques, in parameter estimation, and all the other amazing developments that people in other fields adjacent to system dynamics have developed. And one of the goals that of good system dynamics education should be to make sure everybody understands that there's wonderful, useful work out there, and then has an opportunity to learn those tools. Okay, so now let's talk about climate change. So some of you are probably familiar with the En-ROADS climate action simulation, the climate policy model that we've developed in my group at MIT in close partnership and collaboration with the nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank Climate Interactive, founded by Andrew Jones, one of my former students, and a wonderful nonprofit organization. I'll just make a side note here. Many of the key leaders in Climate Interactive live in Asheville, North Carolina, which was heavily damaged by Hurricane Helene that went through there about 3-4 weeks ago. And since it went through, hundreds of people have died in the Southeast United States, North Carolina, and the Asheville region. And the town of Asheville was devastated by this. And the hurricane was greatly amplified by climate change. In fact, besides the death and the deaths and the destruction of housing and businesses and the rivers washing away infrastructure, bridges, roads, down trees everywhere, people, it was a really horrible situation. The water supply was compromised, and for 3 weeks, nobody had any water. So all the people in Climate Interactive basically stopped doing their climate work and instead were spending their days clearing the roads, getting the trees off, finding the people who were missing, and literally carrying water up all the flights of all the apartments and bringing water to people who couldn't carry water up all those flights themselves because they were infirm or elderly or whatever it might be, just so they could flush their toilets. This is climate change happening right now on the ground today. So at MIT, what are we doing about that? Well, our new MIT president, Sally Kornbluth, has made climate change the centerpiece of her new administration, correctly calling it one of the greatest scientific and societal challenges of this or any age. I'm on a committee to help stand this up, and we're in the middle of interviewing the people who are going to lead this initiative and allocate the initial budgets. A lot of this grows out of work that we've done at the MIT Sloan School, which in turn grew out of the system dynamics work that our group has been doing for decades. The MIT Sloan Sustainability Initiative that I and colleagues founded in 2006, which then led to the Climate Pathways Project, and then the new Climate Policy Center, all of which are aimed at bringing system dynamics and other disciplines and tools to bear on how to make a difference on this problem. So I don't think I need to tell you all about climate change. There's no credible doubt that the climate is changing, that the primary cause is us, humanity, especially burning fossil fuels, and that climate change poses a grave risk to our prosperity, our health, our national security everywhere in the world, and even our lives. That's not in doubt. What is contested, what is debated, where there is no agreement is what should we do about it? So you'll find people out there saying if we just do any one of the things on this list, problem solved. We just need more renewables, or we need more nuclear, or we need fusion, or we just have to get rid of the coal, or everybody should stop eating meat, or we need carbon capture, or more technological breakthroughs, or more government regulation, or just trust the market to solve these problems. No agreement here. So what we've done is we developed the En-ROADS Climate Policy Simulator, which is a large, complex, carefully grounded in evidence system dynamics model that is also completely free for every one of you and anybody in the world to use, fully documented and completely transparent. And so how has this model been used? It's been used all over the world. This is fairly recent data. You can see over 1.5 million users, more than 15,000 are senior leaders in government, business, and civil society, and almost 390,000 people now in 171 countries, including in Singapore and many other countries, not just in the United States, not just in Europe, have participated in interactive system dynamics workshops using this tool. And just to give a few examples, John Kerry, the former Secretary of State of the United States and former climate envoy, has been a fan of the work since 2008. I've presented it twice to the Dalai Lama. One of my colleagues presented it to government and business leaders in Indonesia. I presented it in Beijing to senior leaders, in Paris, in the U.S. Congress multiple times. I think I've personally briefed 36 U.S. senators, over 150 members of our House of Representatives, several members of President Biden's cabinet, governors of our states, mayors, city councils, and many of our teammates have done the same, and we've briefed many of their leaders' counterparts in other countries around the world. So the model really is being used, and it's really having some impact. But what I'm going to do for the next just couple of minutes is let's do it together. So we're going to get out of PowerPoint, and we'll go and look at the simulation. Remember, it's free. You can try it yourself. I don't have time to show you all of the details of what's under the hood, but the first thing is it's available in 20 languages, including traditional and simplified Mandarin, Arabic, Hebrew, Russian, huge number of other languages, Japanese, Hindi. So feel free to use it locally, whatever community you can. And if you see language that's important that we don't have, let us know. We can try to add it. So under the hood here is the large system dynamics model, but the interface has been very carefully designed so that ordinary people can use the model without having a PhD in climate science or economics from MIT. So how does it work? Here we've got total global primary energy by source, coal in brown at the bottom, oil here, fossil gases here, wind, solar, hydro, geothermal, the renewables are here. Now they're all modeled separately because they have different costs and supply curves and rates of technological progress, but they're all added in the green wedge of renewables. 3 different ways to make bioenergy: from wood, from wastes, from crops and crop residues, and nuclear power on top. We've carefully grounded it in historical data. You can look at all that yourself later. Here's the history of global warming. The model tracks it extremely well. But let's take a look at what this means. We're using the UN's population projections for the world here. You can see it here by region. And if you don't like our assumptions, what makes this so useful is you don't have to agree. You can say population is going to be lower or higher, and the model instantly resimulates and shows you what the implications would be. So in the base case, the growth in energy demand around the world is largely met by growing renewables, but that leaves a world heavily dependent on fossil fuels, which means greenhouse gas emissions over here from CO2 from burning fossil fuels, from methane, from land and deforestation, from nitrous oxide and from fluorinated gases, they continue to grow, and that leads to steady global warming, passing through the Paris goal of 1.5 degrees by the end of this decade, and then breaching the 2-degree threshold by 2050. And you'll all still be around. And this is not a world you want to live in. And it just keeps going up to well over 3 degrees by 2100, and we keep going after that. So what would some of the implications be? Well, we model many of the impacts, and I don't have time to go through them, but we're modeling air pollution from energy, which is extremely harmful. PM 2.5, very harmful to human health. Premature deaths are 7 or 8 million a year, according to WHO from this. Hurts labor productivity, it hurts the cognitive and other development of kids and their performance in school and later life. Crop yields are expected to fall with this amount of warming. In a world where we're expecting to have to feed 2.1 billion more people by 2100, deaths from exposure to extreme heat expected to grow dramatically. And you'll notice that that's going to be worst where you all live. Why? Because you're already closer to the survivable limit. Wet bulb temperatures are already higher in Southeast Asia than most other parts of the world, and perhaps not in Singapore, but in all your neighbors, many more people are working outdoors in agriculture or in construction and don't have access to air conditioning. But even in the colder climates of affluent countries like Northern Europe or Australia, North America, deaths from heat are going to increase dramatically above the already intolerable levels they're at today. There are many more impacts that we look at, including sea level rise. Let's take a look at a couple of examples. Takes a second to do this. Actually, here we go. Yeah, all right. So this is Shanghai. Let me make it bigger. So this is Shanghai under in 2050, not even 2100. And all of this blue is below sea level now. That may not look too bad to you, but this would be devastating to Shanghai. And of course, there are typhoons in this part of the world. Shanghai just had a near miss with one this year. If you had a storm surge of even as little as 3.5 meters, and I would remind you that some of the typhoons that have just happened in the Western Pacific had storm surges much bigger than this. This is the consequence for Shanghai. This is catastrophic. Now, I'm not going to show you Singapore because I want you to try the model yourself and figure out what's at risk here. And I'll just, little spoiler alert, goodbye airport. So this is just one example. You can look at many other places. I'm not going to show you many more, but let's look at the Indus Delta. So I'm going to zoom out here. I still have a storm. Let me make it smaller. Now, this region is not a linchpin of the globalized economy or global supply chains. Why is this important to everyone? Well, first of all, climate change is already displacing people on this delta area, the delta of the Indus, and those people have to migrate somewhere else. But when a storm comes, there will be an acute crisis, humanitarian crisis, with millions, potentially millions of people displaced as climate refugees on a border of these two great nations of India and Pakistan, great nations that, however, do not have good relations with one another and both have nuclear weapons. So wherever you live in the world, sometimes I do this and people say, oh, I live in Zurich. I don't care about sea level rise. Well, that's deeply wrong, not consistent with systems thinking. Okay, so many other impacts that we model, but what about all of the harms from climate change? What does that do to economic growth? Well, it significantly reduces economic growth. This is uncertain, and you can change the assumptions about this, but what you're seeing here is one of the more optimistic studies. I personally think the most recent science suggests much larger declines. But take a look at this. The dashed line is what GDP would be if climate change had no further impact on the economy, which we know is false. And the solid line is how much economic growth there is given the warming and the harms that we've looked at and all the other ones that we're not modeling right now. Now, some people say, oh, well, gosh, look, the economy is still growing. What's the problem? Well, here's the problem. You see that little dip right there? That's the economic harm globally from COVID. And that was horrible enough. Compared to what's coming from climate change, even under these optimistic assumptions, COVID is an insignificant blip. So your job, and we don't have time to do this interactively, but what we do is we sit down with members of president's cabinet or senior members of our government or whoever it might be, and we say, okay, now what would you like to try to solve this problem, to reduce emissions and limit temperatures to no more than 2 degrees, stick to the Paris targets. And here are all the policy levers that you might try. So we never tell people what to do. It's always completely up to them. Now, unfortunately, we don't have the time to do it the right way. But a very common suggestion that we hear all the time is, well, let's just go big on nuclear. So I'm going to heavily subsidize nuclear. Now, notice where we are. We're at 3.3 C, and I'm going to heavily subsidize nuclear power. 1/10 of a degree of improvement. So first question is, well, did we get more nuclear? The answer is we got a huge amount more nuclear. Why doesn't it make more difference to the climate? Well, this is something we would explore interactively with participants, but in brief, it takes so long to build new nuclear power plants. In the meantime, you're still burning all that fossil fuel, and once it's in the air, it keeps warming the climate every day for hundreds of years. And the second and more subtle effect, look at the energy mix over here. Before the subsidy, with the subsidy. So coal goes down, great. Fossil fuels go down, but so do the renewables. You make it more attractive economically for a country or a utility to build nuclear power, and they will. It's very expensive, but they will. They're also going to build fewer coal plants, great, but they're also going to build fewer utility scale solar plants and offshore wind farms. So the nuclear is cannibalizing some of the other zero carbon energy sources, and that's accounting for the low impact. And this is very expensive. So this is one example of the value of the model. Well, what does work? It's entirely up to the participants to tell us what works, but a couple of ideas. First of all, a price on carbon makes a big, big difference. So a moderate price on carbon, huge impact, huge impact. And this is actually happening in many countries around the world now. There's 110 countries or provinces or states or other governmental units that have carbon prices today, including China, including Indonesia, including other developing countries, not just Europe. Now, prices are too low on average, and this isn't the whole world, but anything that exists is possible. What else makes a huge difference? Even with the carbon price, we haven't completely solved the problem. So what are some of the other things that really matter? Well, energy efficiency is the fastest, safest, and cheapest way to reduce emissions while still helping people get what they want and need and deserve. Remember, nobody wants a ton of coal or a barrel of oil. What people want and need and deserve is to be warm in the winter, cool in the summer, have light when they need light, have good, decent jobs, healthcare, education, cultural opportunities. That's what people want. Energy efficiency is the best, fastest, cheapest way to do that. And the same in transportation. And once you've gotten the coal out of the system, which we've largely done, we could do a little more here by regulating coal out of the system, then electrification of end uses can get you even more benefit. That's still not quite getting us where we want to go. Let's promote the renewables, much cheaper than nuclear, with storage. Let's have some nature-based solutions. Let's reduce emissions from agriculture. Let's cut deforestation. There's 2 degrees. Oh, and let's cut some of the methane and fluorinated gases and nitrous oxide. There's 1.8 with no technological magic at all. We're not relying on fusion power, which wouldn't make any difference anyway, because it cannibalizes your nuclear and your renewables, and it takes too long. We're not relying on unproven, expensive technologies like direct air capture. Pretty much everything you see here can be done today and with reasonable rates of learning and scale. So this is just an illustration of the model. I invite you all to play with it yourself. And oh, by the way, what are the benefits of this? Well, let's look at some of the benefits. Let's look at wildfire risk, for example. Let's go over to your part of the world. In the baseline, there's enhanced wildfire risk essentially all over China, India, and Southeast Asia. In the current scenario, that is 1.8, the safer world, those risks are enormously reduced. That's a safer, healthier world for everybody in your part of our globe. I'd invite you to try this out yourself. Air pollution is way down. Crop yields are still going to fall, but by much, much less. That's a safer world with fewer people suffering from starvation and food insecurity and being forced as migrants, which can promote civil conflict and international conflict. Heat-related deaths are going to be down, et cetera, et cetera. What about GDP? People tell me, oh my gosh, this is going to be so expensive. We can't afford it. It's going to hurt the economy. On the contrary, because all these harms from climate change are so greatly reduced, economic growth is going to be much higher than it would otherwise be. That's good for poverty reduction around the world, for social justice and equity, and for businesses who will now have wealthier, more affluent customers. So that's what the model can do. Then the question is, well, wait a minute, does any of this actually work? So we have published a variety of papers about the impact of this tool. I'm trying to bring my slides back up. There we go. And all of these are open access. But let me just give you an example. So typically in our workshops, we'll ask people to fill out this prompt using Poll Everywhere. I am blank about climate change before they participate in a modeling workshop. And you can see what they say. I'm alarmed, concerned, worried, terrified, overwhelmed, heartbroken. After the workshop, same prompt. Now they say, I'm passionate, hopeful, I'm going to do something, I got to act, I'm energized. Not everybody, but the majority. This is typical. The rigorous evaluation data, and I'm not going to spend time on this, but before the workshop, for a large sample of people, they don't know that much about what causes climate change. They feel nervous and they feel a sense of urgency. They're not very hopeful that we can make a difference. They don't know what are the high leverage actions. They'd like to do something and they don't feel much personal agency. They don't feel that what they do can matter. After the workshop, they all improve. Margins are highly statistically significant. And even 6 months later, there's been a little decline, but the gaps, the differences, what they've learned and taken away are still way, way bigger than when they started. So that's just a little quick example of what can matter. I'll close here with an example of how this can matter, not just for policymakers, but for students. So one of our team members, Professor Juliette Rooney-Varga at the University of Massachusetts, she went to the public high school in Cambridge, Massachusetts. This is an ethnically diverse urban high school with people from all walks of life and socioeconomic levels. And there's the control group is what you're seeing here. So she gave a typical lecture about climate change that students might hear in high school. Let's just see what's happening here. You don't actually have to hear what she's saying. The question is, do you think there's any learning happening in this room? And the answer is obvious, no learning whatsoever. So that's the control group. Nobody's learning anything. The treatment group is they did a role play simulation of the global climate negotiations, such as Copenhagen in 2009, Paris in 2015, Baku, Azerbaijan coming up in just a few weeks. They play the roles of different countries. This gentleman here in the red sweatshirt is playing the president of the United States, and these are the leaders of other countries trying to persuade the United States to put more money into the loss and damage fund, put more money to help their developing economies get rid of fossil fuels and go directly to renewable energy. So they negotiate, they propose things, and then we put those proposals right into the model and give them immediate feedback. And well, take a look at what's happening here. You don't really need to hear what's happening. You can just tell there's an enormous amount of engagement. They're arguing over the money. Look at this guy, he's so skeptical. Where's the money going to come from? Who's going to pay for this? And they're telling him why it's in the economic interest and the national security interest of the United States to do this. It's amazing. They have learned so much. They are participating, and they're not only learning about climate change, they're learning public speaking, they're learning negotiation, they're learning other life skills that will serve them well for the rest of their lives and careers. So that's just an example of what you can do here. We do this in education a lot. Last year, I ran the role play for our first year MBA students. You can see that the net promoter score for the En-ROADS simulation workshop was 91, and the average of all the other leadership and ethics workshops that Sloan offered was only 32. And then in August, I did it for the incoming undergraduate MIT class of 2028. And we had our president, Sally Kornbluth, introduce it. And then all the students worked on their own laptops in partnership with others to develop their own scenarios, learning for themselves, trying whatever they want, and then explaining what they did. This really works. And if you're not already using it all over RC4, I would urge you to do so. And if you are, take it to all the other communities and constituencies that you have. So let me wrap it up. In addition to all the things we've talked about, what's the most important thing for us to do? Make sure that you are aiming high. Life is too short to work on problems that don't matter now, no matter how intellectually exciting they might be. There's so many intellectually exciting issues to work on that also desperately need to be addressed. You folks can do it. You are leaders in this work with your training. I'm expecting great things from all of you all. Thank you very much. If there's any time left, I'd be delighted to take questions.